All right, so last time we discussed how oral narratives are important in the role that they play, in how they sustain traditions and how they sustain what has come from before and then they create moral meaning now. But today we're going to talk about how oral narratives are important as literature and in the linguistic features which they use. So, involved in that, in the Native American community, there is often opposition to the use of English in writing because these were both introduced by force. Right after Columbus came, the Spaniards arrived with a document, the Requerimiento, and it specified that the Spanish were taking control of all this land that these very uneducated peoples are currently using, and that they had the right to conquest. They had the right to take it by force, even though the Native Americans had not really encountered this writing before, even though the Native Americans had never given their signature or anything of the sort, all of a sudden this writing signified that they had lost everything that they held dear. Another example of how English and writing have negative connotations is because in the 1800s more so, and I believe in the early 1900s, Native American children would be kidnapped and taken to boarding schools, or their parents would be blackmailed into sending them into boarding schools, where the children would be forced to learn English, would be forced to learn writing, where they would have to talk, dress, act, write like American children. They weren't allowed to speak their own languages, and it was this Americanization process that was so brutal and so difficult, and it ripped away their culture. As a result, Native American oral narratives combat this in that they are often told in native languages. They value native languages. That is where they have the most meaning, is in the native language. They also are traditional and that they sustain these traditions and they do not submit to the westernization that was attempted to be forced upon them. So that is how they are valuable in opposition to those forced language features. Oral narratives also promote solidarity through opposition of westernization because they break down the Western ideals of literacy, of what literature should be, of what speaking and writing should be. An example of this is that in oral narratives, the pronoun that is often used is us. It's we. It's the first person plural. In American stories, in Western stories, it's more often I. It's more often me, my experiences, my stories, as opposed to the Native American our stories and us. Thus, it promotes a feeling of community both in just how it's presented, in that we always use the first person plural, but it also opposes the first person singular that is otherwise used in the culture outside of theirs, in the dominant culture. Also, oral narratives oppose the American ideal of literacy in that the American is extremely antisocial. The pronouns is an example of that. Another example of that is that in Western culture we very much prize the idea of genius, of someone being truly great and a wonderful writer. You think of Shakespeare, you think of Homer, you think of goodness knows who else, but these great figures who were geniuses, who we look up to and desire to emulate, that I shall be like him, or I shall be like her. The Native American ideal does not have this genius. Those who create Native American oral narratives do not try to become geniuses. Instead, oral narratives tend to be much more communal property. They will be shared between tribes even, and certainly within members, although there are guides to how you ask to tell someone else's story, but still the stories do not often have a direct author, in that they were passed down and no one knows their author. It's just our tribe's story. So you have this opposition to the American ideals. Consequently, oral narratives really tend to build community through opposition. It's this community of solidarity in that we are together against what would be thrust upon us. And a wonderful quote that I heard was by this storyteller, and once again I cite it in my notes, so definitely look at that. And the book is called Who Speaks, and it's really an excellent book. Anyway, the story, in the quote rather, the storyteller says that stories connect those who have spoken in the past with those of us whose voices are still carried on the winds of breath, and those who are yet to come. Thus, a large part of the importance of oral narratives is this community of us being joined together, both joined together in our traditions, as I talked about in the last video, and joined together in our opposition to what would be thrust upon us. So for next time, we will discuss why oral narratives are important in that they are oral, specifically the speaking part of them. They do not have nearly the same impact if they are written, and we will discuss why that is and why oral narratives, specifically as being oral, build community.